Sam, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for having me on. Well, I'm a philosopher of mind and metaphysics, and I'm based in the UK at London. I'm in the University of Hertfordshire, which is just a bit north of London. As well as metaphysics stuff, I'm interested in psychology and cog sci, so I spend a lot of time looking at neuroscience papers and psychology papers and trying to get an overview of how those issues fit in with philosophy of mind and metaphysics to give us one big picture of the mind, especially consciousness, I suppose, is my thing.
Cool. So the topic today was reasons to believe in pantheism. Could you tell us what you mean by pantheism and why you think it's rational as opposed to like naturalism, which is more my position?
Pantheism is the view that God coincides with the universe in some way, like God is identical to the universe, as opposed to like a panentheistic view on which the universe makes up a part of God, or God is transcendent or apart from the universe. Why? So what's the question? Why is it reasonable to believe in pantheism?
Yeah.
This is a good question. I mean, I don't know that in the paper that you've read, I think I don't so much as go into reasons for believing in pantheism as try and get rid of reasons against believing in it. Namely, people can't understand how the universe could be a person. But I guess I've never really known what was wrong with the ontological argument, say. I've always been fairly impressed by that. And I just had this feeling that there's a God as well, I don't know, which I can't seem to get rid of. Why pantheism as opposed to another form of theism? It's very elegant. I mean, we've got the universe, we've got God. It's quite parsimonious to identify the two, and it makes sense of the idea that we're part of God. If you think there's like a telos to the universe, that might fit in quite nicely with God. I guess it's stuff like that.
But what do you mean by God? From my perspective, I think that there is some fundamental nature to reality, which I think is more like a quantum field of some kind. So it would probably be eternal and all powerful, or those aspects of what is classically thought of as a God, but it wouldn't be conscious or have intentions of those kinds. So how would you define the fundamental nature of reality that you call God?
Well, God is a mind. God is, in that sense, a person. I'm not certain why you oppose that to naturalism, and I'm not certain why you think that would be incompatible with like a quantum field theory either. I see those things as fitting together fairly well. God is the mind that the biggest mind, the mind that encompasses. God is all. So that's again an idea that is captured in pantheism quite nicely. God is, in some sense, the sustainer or creator of the universe, and God can play that role by being the universe, again, quite neatly. So that's what
my first thought is like quantum fields, and in naturalism, there's like a maximum speed of information can travel, the speed of light, and the universe is quite bigger than the distance light could travel. And so if the universe had a mind of some kind, there'd be no way for information to travel from one side to the other. It would be unlike any kind of mind we could imagine, simply by the virtue of the maximum speed energy or information can travel. And since we typically in naturalism, we think that minds and consciousnesses are only like physical things that are emergent from brains, I think is the majority view in the field. And so it would be hard to think that there was such a thing that encapsulated the universe as a whole in any way.
Well, if the brain is important for the mind, it's not because of the whole brain, because there are large chunks of the brain that aren't conscious and aren't part of your mind. So it's something about the connections within brains that matter, as far as we know. And as for, I'm not sure what you mean by information, but you're thinking of an analogy with how brains function. Information transfer across brains could only happen as fast as the speed of light, say. But there are quantum phenomena where there's instant information transfer. As far as I understand, I guess one might want to invoke that kind of thing.
Well, just to clarify, I would object to that, because I do know entanglement is the process where there can be instant shifts from one particle to another over infinite distance, but there can't be information transfer. That's the part that physicists are like, no, that doesn't happen. That's because there's a big important law in physics that says information can't be transmitted faster than the speed of light. And this does not violate that principle. It just means that the spin of one object is the opposite spin of another object at a certain distance, but it doesn't tell you any information that goes from one side to the other, because it could still be either spin one way or the other. You could never know which one is which. And so there's a big thing in physics that there's no way for any kind of meaningful information to be transmitted from large distances, in which case a mind having like one idea at one side of the brain, it would never be able to get to the other side of the universe.
That's information of an observer's information about the system, but I'm talking about constitutive relations within the system. I'm not wholly certain what you mean by information here. I mean, I'm aware of some ways it can be understood in physics, but I'm not talking about an observer, the information an observer can glean from a system. I'm talking about relations within the system themselves, and those can clearly happen faster than light. They can happen, it seems, instantaneously. Now, that depends on your vision of how quantum works, but I'm not seeing a decisive objection there.
Yeah, I would say it's hard to imagine, given what we know, that any kind of mind is possible at that scale. I don't think it doesn't seem to make sense to me to think of a brain or some kind of an analogous to something to a brain that can mediate consciousness at the universe scale. It seems like that is contrary to most of the things we know about the universe. Why would that be something we would infer about the universe? Why would we think it has consciousness in any way?
Well, I don't think it has consciousness, and that's the point of my theory of personhood, is that persons don't require consciousness. So that's what I see as quite important to defending pantheism against accusations that it can't understand the universe as being a person. I don't think being a mind requires consciousness. I mean, it would still require connections between mental states, constitutive causal connections, but as I say, from what I understand, I'm not a physicist, but from what I understand, such connections can occur pretty much instantaneously, and that's not. I'm not really sure how the notion of information gets into undermining that idea, but perhaps I just haven't understood you.
What do you mean you can have a mind without consciousness?
Well, it's pretty clear that at least some parts of our mind aren't conscious. I mean, right now, your mind comprises stuff like your memory of what you had for breakfast, formative memories, long-term character traits, likes, dislikes, preferences. Those aren't all in your consciousness right now. So there's chunks of your mind, arguably the larger part, that are unconscious right now. And I don't myself see consciousness as anything other than incidental to them. It's like a narrow window on a little bit of our mind right now, but by far the larger part is unconscious. And so I don't see any objection in principle to a mind that wholly lacked consciousness. I mean, you get this in sci-fi, right? When we think about, I don't know, Commander Data as being a person, or in Star Trek, or maybe C3PO or something like that. They arguably got person and they've got minds, but they don't seem to be conscious creatures. They don't seem to have sensations. I guess that's what it comes down to when I mean consciousness.
Because I think of consciousness as like quality experience, what it's like to be something. And so I would say C3PO and Data would probably have consciousness, but say my computer probably doesn't have consciousness. But it does have all of the things you mentioned, like it has a memory, it has information saved in that memory that it can recall and do stuff with that information. But I wouldn't say that my computer has a mind. I'd say it's just kind of a causal system that's determined by the physical processes within it that doesn't have any relation to conscious experience of the world. It has no experience, has no like what it's like to be a computer. Whereas like for Data and C3PO, I think they probably would have a what it's like to be them. And so they would have consciousness. In that sense of consciousness, the like what it's like to be something, would your idea of a god have that, or would it be more like a computer?
I don't think qualia require consciousness at all. There are pains that can exist unfelt. The qualia of, I mean, common sense makes qualia exist unconsciously, and naive realism views of perception, right? If I'm looking at right now, looking at the wall in front of me, it's kind of beige, or my coffee cup is blue. The screen in front of me is like partially blue, and I think that when I close my eyes, the cup is still blue. There are naive realist views of perceptual experience where the blueness literally exists on the cup. So when I close my eyes, that blueness is still there. Some people say qualia ain't in the head. On those views, the qualia doesn't depend on my being aware of it. And I think of qualia rather like that, except I don't, as it happens, put them in the outside world. With respect to my perception, I put them in the brain, but I don't see that they need to depend on consciousness at all. So I guess we disagree over qualia, but I've never heard a good argument why qualia have got to be conscious. And I mean, and it's like two steps there. One is people think qualia have always got to be conscious, and the next one is that they kind of conflate or confuse mentality with consciousness. I think those are mistakes.
So you're defining consciousness and mentality as something that would potentially cause a conscious experience?
You can think of like, so if you just take the example of my blue cup, right? What gives me an experience of the blueness of the cup is two things. One is the blueness quality, or qualia, if you want to call it that. And then my awareness of it. Now I'm not aware of it. My eyes are closed. I open my eyes, I'm aware of it. So now I've got an experience. So the experience is awareness plus the quality. And I think the same is true of a pain that I'm feeling as opposed to a pain I'm not feeling. So I have a lot of, in my view, qualitative mental states of which I'm not aware, but I'm aware of a subset of them at a time. And those form, like my hearing your voice, my seeing you, the stuff I'm currently thinking about. But there's a whole other bunch of stuff in the background that I think is also qualitative, or has what its likeness in the sense you point to, like the Thomas Nagel inspired sense. They're not like something subjectively for me at this time, but they have a quality or a character that I can access, I can experience. I just have to become aware of them.
So like say I amputated my leg and someone took a electrode and started to zap the neurons in my leg. Would they still have some kind of qualia experience?
I don't think they have experience. Experience is consciousness, so I don't think they have experience. But I do think that, I do think that they have a qualitative character. Yeah, I do think they have a quality. But I mean, that's like going into my broader metaphysics, which puts qualities kind of everywhere, which is involved in the view of God that I hold. But the more local thesis is that the sort of smaller starting idea is that human mentality, as it's associated with the brain, just talking about the brain for now, is a matter of qualities and then an awareness relation. So I don't know, you might think, well, the contents of my visual experience are processed in my occipital lobe in the visual cortex, but that's not enough to get consciousness, because people can have that activity without being conscious of it. Like if certain kinds of brain damage, what you need is prefrontal areas to access or tap or scan the sensory cortex, and then you get that's a kind of awareness of what's in there. But the qualities are in the brain, I think. So there's like a two component model of consciousness, if you like.
So why think that was the case? Why think that there was some qualities that existed in everything, and it wasn't just some kind of local phenomenon where these things were being interpreted by the brain, but there was no actual qualities that existed in these objects to cause that?
You seem to be asking two questions there. One is why I think qualities are literally everywhere in the world, and the other one is why I think there are qualities when consciousness isn't. Why I think qualities aren't just something consciousness manufactures. Why I think that it's something that it reveals. Is that right? Have I understood you right?
Yeah.
Maybe I could talk about the second question first, because they're separable questions. You might think that qualities are only in the brain, but they can exist independently of consciousness. So they're different questions, right? Why do I think qualities exist without awareness? Well, Freud basically thought that you couldn't explain everything somebody did just by talking about what's in their consciousness. You needed to invoke unconscious states as well, because you might tell me I'm behaving angrily today. You might say, Sam, you're really snappy today. You're short-tempered and so on, and I might like do some introspection. I go, I don't feel angry. I'm not angry. And you go, no, really, you're behaving angrily. And it's just as if I were consciously angry, except I'm not feeling it. So it's as if I had an anger, if I had a conscious anger quale and I went, oh yeah, you're right, I feel angry, and I'm just like taking it out on everyone, I'm sorry. that would make perfect sense. But if I try and explain it away in the case where I don't feel the anger, I'll say, oh, just preoccupied or whatever. And you'll be like, no, that doesn't explain why you keep snapping at me. So there, well, this is kind of according to Freud's reasoning, the natural thing would be natural thing to do is to say, I've got a similar state to the one that would explain my behavior if it were conscious, but I'm not aware of it. So in this case, it would be an unconscious anger. And if you think anger is a feeling or involves qualia, that will give you the simplest hypothesis is that it's the same kind of phenomenon, influencing my behavior. It's just not conscious, in which case it would be unconscious anger qualia. And I think that I get woken up by, at the moment I've had a migraine for a couple of days, and anyone who gets migraine, horrible thing about it is it can last for days. It can wake you up. I got woken up last night by pain. But if I'm woken up by pain, literally by pain brings me to a state of consciousness from unconsciousness. It had to pre-exist my consciousness, so it had to exist unfelt. So I think there's evidence for unfelt pains. There's people who protect injuries during the night. There's people who, people do all kinds of funny behaviors in the night, which in waking life would be put down to sensations they're having. So I think there are a bunch of unfelt qualities, or to put it slightly paradoxically sounding, unfelt feelings. So I wouldn't call them feelings because they're not literally felt. So that's the answer to the second question, at least.
So how do you interpret something like phantom limb syndrome, where people have feelings of things that literally aren't there?
Well, he used to you got to have your arm amputated at the elbow because of whatever, and then people would get pain at the stump, so they would chop the stump, but the pain wouldn't go away. They'd keep chopping, or it would itch, whatever. I think we think now that the sensations you feel in the phantom limb are because of the Penfold homunculus in the brain, which is like a little sensory map of the body. It corresponds, it's like larger for areas that have got more nerve endings. So there's like a big area for the lips and the hands and so on, smaller areas for bits that lack so much feeling. So how do I explain it? Well, if you've got activity in the Penfold homunculus, then you have feelings that are as if you had a limb, because that's a sensory map of your body, and that's in a sense where the feelings of your body really are. They're not literally in your body, counterintuitive as that may seem.
So,
but that's independent of my views about qualia being potentially unconscious and stuff.
Well, that seems like those would be contradictory views, where we can have this sensation of consciousness being just electrical signals in the brain, versus qualia having these properties that actually exist somewhere in the universe. Why, if we can explain consciousness fully in this electrical, biological sense, would we also think that there are these actually qualia experience property things that actually existed? They seem superfluous, like an extra thing there that we don't need.
Yeah, right. Well, I guess I think that the deep reality of what you're calling the electrical signals is qualia. Like calling them electrical signals is a way of describing them according to measure them in third personal terms or objective terms. But there's more to them than we can get from those measurements. And what's a bit like, you'd be familiar probably with panpsychist or monist views. And so I say something similar, except that I don't get this missing or harder to measure. Phenomenally conscious itself, I say it's qualitative. Now, the question of why there is a similar answer to the one the panpsychist gives. I don't see how, if basic matter can get them out by combining it. That's it's explanatory. It's just a sort of explanatory gap, is to say that there must be some extra properties in matter, such as when it's combined to give us kind of rich mental life that we know.
I find that argument problematic, because we don't really seem to have a good argument for fundamental things. And to say that we can't imagine how combining the stuff that we know about could get to this, therefore it must be fundamental, doesn't seem like something like a strong enough burden of proof to justify belief that anything is fundamental, because everything, as far as we can tell, with the exception of like energy and quantum fields, are emergent phenomenons from combinations of stuff. So why assume that simply because we don't know how we could get consciousness from combinations of this stuff, that it therefore must be fundamental, given that we don't have good arguments for fundamental things in general? And so simply saying that we can't imagine how it's done doesn't seem like a sufficient reason to argue that it is or must be a fundamental thing.
What do you mean by we don't have good good arguments for fundamental things as such?
Like everything we've ever discovered seems to be reducible to more fundamental things, and we don't really have any way to say, oh, this thing we've discovered now, it's not reducible. It's the fundamental thingy. It's always, well, that could probably be reduced in some other way that we just don't know about yet. And so to say that because I can't imagine how it could be reduced doesn't seem to be a good way to conclude that it's irreducible, because people have made that argument many times, and so it's not really a good way to conclude that it's truly fundamental. And so I don't think there's like an epistemic grounds in science or anything that's like, yeah, we found the fundamental thing and we can stop looking. It's always like tentatively fundamental, like energy, and so to infer that like consciousness must be a fundamental thing because we can't imagine how it would be reducible doesn't seem like a good epistemic reason to make that conclusion.
Well, it is a good reason if you think that the macro properties of the brain are due to the micro properties of the brain, or the stuff that causes it. It's a reasonable hypothesis to say you've got to give the ingredients what they need to produce the macroscopic system. I mean, we ascribe mass to things all the way down. The reason we do that is to give big things mass. The person who I think wrongly ascribes consciousness all the way down does that to explain consciousness at the macro level. It's not a knockdown argument, but it's a perfectly reasonable hypothesis. It's no less unreasonable than saying micro things have got mass because macro things have got mass. I can't see that it's an unreasonable hypothesis. It's quite elegant. We often explain the ingredients of things by saying they've got to suffice for the macro properties. It's like a very common strategy.
Well, I don't. Okay. I think pretty much anything is a reasonable. Well, like hypothesis as a whole could be anything. You can make up anything you want as a hypothesis. I think that's fine as long as there's no like logical contradictions. But if I wanted to say like pineapples,
what's the logical contradiction?
No, I'd say any hypothesis is fine as long as there's not a logical contradiction. My standard for what makes a reasonable hypothesis is very low. It's just anything, no logical contradiction.
Okay.
And so, but if I made the argument like what makes something a pineapple is this pineappleness, and to say it acquires pineappleness because the particles within the pineapple have pineappleness somewhere in them, and the accumulation of the pineappleness makes it a pineapple, doesn't seem like a very good argument. It seems like a composition division fallacy to say that some property of the whole must be instantiated by the property of its parts. Well, that's not the case. We know there's emergent properties. It happens all the time. And so in the case of mass, the reason we can infer that large things have mass is because we can demonstrate their parts have mass. We can demonstrate the parts of those parts have mass. It's not just a hypothesis. It's that we've shown that these things have mass, where I don't think that's the case in consciousness. I don't think we can go, the occipital cortex has consciousness in it. Like, no, we don't see that anywhere. And so in the case of matter, it seems rational because we have a lot of evidence that the parts have mass individually, and we can demonstrate them all the way down to the electron or to the like boson level. Whereas it doesn't seem to be the case in consciousness. And so the consciousness case seems more analogous to my pineapple example than to the mass example.
It's a good case, the pineapple. Oh, sorry, you're okay.
Oh no, I think we're just lagging. I think it's just breaking up a little bit.
Is it? I mean, my connection seems to be good. I'm not sure what like it is. Thing one. But point about the pineapple, explain the pineapple-ness in other ways, right? The pineapple-ness is, I don't know, to do with the texture and so on of the part. You need pineapple-ness all the way down, but we don't yet have an explanation like that. So the onus is on people who say what you're saying to give us some kind of in the absence of that, it's a reasonable suggestion. Consciousness or what I'm calling qualitativity, I suppose, qualia, go all the way down in the way that mass does. Now, it's true that we can demonstrate that the microparticles have got mass, whereas we can't demonstrate they've got consciousness. But that's not what's at issue. What's at issue is whether it's a sensible, reasonable inference, not whether it can be demonstrated yet, if ever. And there have got reasons for thinking that it can't be demonstrated in the sense that you're talking about. I mean, people might think it can be deductively demonstrated, but you're talking about measuring it in a scientific way. But it's a reasonable hypothesis in the absence of any explanation. If somebody comes up tomorrow with an explanation of how non-sentient matter can produce sentience, then fine. But notoriously, there isn't such an explanation, and there seem reasons for thinking there can't be, because there are things like zombies that are conceivable, or there's, Mary in her black and white room and so on. So those are the things you can get, I don't know, colourful qualities out of stuff that wholly lacks quality. I just don't see that that's possible.
Well, why would we take one of those? Because I think, like I said, all hypotheses I think are pretty much reasonable from the offset, and then to make one more plausible, you need some kind of evidence. And so, prima facie, I'd say both are equally reasonable. To say that consciousness is some combination thing that happens all the way down versus it's an emergent property, without any kind of evidence, I think both would be equally as valuable from the beginning, prima facie. But then, looking at the evidence we have of the world, I don't see why the arguments like Mary's room or the zombies argument would count as powerfully as the facts of neurology, the ability to make novel predictions about how interacting with the brain will cause effects on consciousness or limit consciousness. And those being successful seem to be a far stronger reason to conclude consciousness is directly caused from the brain than to think it's some more emergent phenomenon simply because of the arguments. I don't think the arguments are anything more than just thought experiments. I don't think thought experiments are a good representation of reality as much as like scientific testing.
You're expressing a view there, but I'm not seeing what your argument is for it. You've got a faith in what you call, as opposed to what you call thought experiments. But I'd like to hear what the independent support for that is. After all, there's no empirical experiment that shows that, as we call it, is the only means to the truth about the world. I'm not sure why you say that you think neurology can make such great predictions about consciousness. It can't at all. We've very little clue as to what the neural correlates of consciousness are. I mean, I was just doing a seminar the other day about the fact that we can't really be sure whether people in so-called vegetative states have got consciousness or not. And the reason is we're not sure what the neural basis of consciousness is. We just can't make those predictions. It's an utter mystery, I'm afraid.
While I would grant that, I think one side is making progress in the field and understanding, and the other side is not as much. And so in the case of like the physicalists, they are the ones being able to make predictions about what's going to work in the brain, and they get them right and they make progress, and that's the entire field of neurology. Whereas thinking consciousness is like a more fundamental kind of thing in all particles doesn't seem to have made any scientific progress as far as I know. And so if I'm like, think of it like an analogy from an engineer's perspective. That guy, both these people say they can fix your car, and that guy's actually fixing cars. I'm going to trust him because he seems to be a more reliable basis of knowledge, as he can actually apply it and get results. Whereas I don't think like Mary's room or the P-zombie argument can be applied to anything in reality to get results, to actually show that it's something that's corresponds to reality outside of our imagination. And so I take evidence to come in the form of, it starts with our imagination, and then we have to use some method to show that that imagination corresponds to reality. And if you don't do that, simply just going off of the imagination part is a lesser form of evidence than the correspondence kind. And so I think science is the hypothesis plus the correspondence, whereas the philosophy is just the hypothesis section. And that's why I think, given the two, science is more reasonable, and I think it's been demonstrated to be more reasonable than simply philosophical arguments in every area that those two things could be accurately tested.
I mean, I'm just not sure why you think we can make very good like neurology can make very good scientific predictions about consciousness. I mean, you've said that twice. I'm just not sure what the basis is for saying that. We don't know whether people in vegetative state are conscious or not. People used to think that they weren't at all until we found, ways of imaging the brain that showed that actually there was mental activity there. People could, be asked to imagine that they were playing tennis or walking through the living room, and we could like tell the difference by brain scans. That doesn't tell us whether the brain activity is conscious or not. The point is, we don't have a very good handle on the neural correlates of consciousness. So you keep saying that we can make predictions from neurology, but I'm not sure why you're so confident of that, or which predictions you're particularly referring to. I mean, the point about that area of research is that there are too many. There's a real danger danger of false negatives. We can't do that imaging, and we can't find the scans, the different areas of them imagining playing tennis or walking through a room. We infer that they lack mentality and consciousness, and we switch them off. I'm thinking about people in vegetative state where, we're talking whether to withdraw feeding tubes and stuff like that. And this is a very serious issue, and there's a real danger of false negatives. And the reason there's a danger of false negatives is because we're not sure what constitutes mental activity or consciousness. We've really got no idea. So I don't know why you're so sure that neurology is making these predictions that you talk about. And that's aside the fact that I'm not sure why making those kinds of predictions is the criterion of success of a philosophical theory either.
Well, for mine, I think that my standard for successful predictions is much lower, simply by saying that consciousness is a part of the brain. If we mess with the visual cortex, you won't be able to see anymore. That, to me, is a successful prediction. So if we think that most, I think, progress in the field of neurology has been done under the physicalist paradigm where the brain causes consciousness, and so if we mess with the brain, we'll be able to mess with the consciousness, and most predictions in the field have confirmed that to some degree. Whereas I haven't seen any successful predictions made from the philosophical idealist panpsychist perspective. I don't see any kind of practical application of things like Barry's rumor or the P zombies argument, whereas practical application is literally all the physicalists care about. That's all we do is practical application. How do we do this? So I agree that we can't get to the level of being able to measure consciousness in the brain yet, but we're still a ways ahead of the philosophical arguments in the fact that we can show neurological correlates to emotions and sight and sound, and we can mess with them, and we can cause specific, like the Britney Spears neuron or whatever. We can just zap the Britney Spears neuron. It's the one that activates when you see a picture of her face or whatever. And so there's lots of progress that's been made in the field, and that progress seems to have been made pretty much entirely by the physicalist paradigm. And so I think, like an engineer who can fix a car, even if he can't fix literally everything in the car, if he's fixing a part of it, I'm going to trust him over the guy who can't fix any parts of the car. The car, of course, being the brain in this context, as far as we can tell. And so for that reason, I think it's more reasonable to trust the one doing the work practically in the field. And you asked, why should confirmation through predictions be the measure that we use to validate philosophical hypotheses? I think the reason for that is because of all of the philosophical hypotheses we can invoke. When tested, the ones that typically correspond to the reality are the ones that can accurately predict the future to some degree. We can make up as many philosophical hypotheses we want, but most of them are wrong unless they're able to correspond to reality, and we do that through testing and scientific predictions. And so I think that is the correct way to assess a theory, because I think it's more likely a theory is correct if it can predict the future, if it can make testable hypotheses and get them right. And I don't think there's any other method that can, to the same degree, validate the likelihood of a theory being right other than its ability to predict the future.
But saying that if we mess with the visual cortex, vision gets messed up, or there's a Britney Spears neuron, that's consistent with dualism, let alone panpsychism or my view. I mean, Descartes thinks that the mind is attached to the brain, even though the mind is non-physical, through the pineal gland or whatever. So he would agree that if you mess with the visual cortex, you're going to mess with consciousness, because he thinks the brain affects the mind. So showing those kinds of correlations just doesn't say anything about whether the mind is wholly physical. It doesn't say anything at all. So that's one of the reasons why I don't see why predictions are the test of a thesis about whether the mind is physical or what the mind's nature is. The datum that if you mess with the brain, you mess with the mind, that's common across all theories. It doesn't help you decide between theories at all.
Well, I understand that you can post hoc make it fit, but that would be like the guy who isn't fixing the car can say, oh, well, even though that guy's doing all the work and fixing the car, that's consistent with my theory, but he's still not fixing the car. And so I think that in the same way, if you can make all of the data fit alternative hypotheses after you've discovered something, but what matters is can you use your hypothesis to make novel predictions and confirm them, then even if a bunch of other hypotheses can take that confirmed data and make it fit their hypothesis post hoc, I don't really care about that at all, because what I care about is the prediction, the being able to know this before we've discovered it and get it right. And if we take the hypothesis that consciousness is fundamental or idealism is true or something like that, we don't intrinsically get this idea that physical matter would affect consciousness. Whereas if we think consciousness is directly a result of physical stuff, we would think, yes, messing with physical stuff would obviously have an effect on consciousness. And so from the physicalist paradigm, it seems to better predict that messing with the brain would cause consciousness intrinsically. It must be the case that that is because we think consciousness is a result of matter. Whereas if we think of the other way, that consciousness is its own thing, then there's no necessary connection between messing with physical stuff would affect consciousness. And so it seems like because the guys fixing the car and making the predictions before we know them and getting it right are all on the physicalist side, and the idealists and panpsychists side are simply post hoc taking that data and saying, well, we can explain that too, but never actually making any successful predictions on their own. It seems to me that the guys doing the work and making the predictions are more trustworthy here, because anybody can post dict things into their hypothesis.
I mean, I think it's wrong that it's post hoc, and I think it's wrong that the physicalist can predict stuff. The only reason we know the visual cortex has got anything to do with vision is because of asking people what happens when we mess with it. If you just looked at brains and people couldn't talk, there'd be no indication from looking at the structure of the visual cortex, neuronal interactions, synaptic connections, neurotransmitters, that it produced things like colors. The different, it's very striking, the different sensory areas of the brain, the auditory area, the visual area, to take two. I mean, they have the same machinery. They're just in different places. The ear and the eye are quite different, but all they do is convert different stimuli into nerve signals. Nerve signals are nerve signals. It's just electrical signals. It's as if I had two factories with the same machinery, but if I put them in different places, they produced completely different things. The difference between a color and a sound, or a color and a smell, is very radical. And if I had the factories with the same machinery in, but just putting one over here or one over there made it produce tanks when it was over here, and clouds or marshmallows when it was over there, we'd think that was an absolute miracle. But that's what the thesis, that different areas of the brain literally produce our sensory experience as radically different as it is with the same basic machinery. That's the physicalist thesis, and it's literally incredible. It's just not believable that the differences in the positions of those areas or their structure makes that kind of qualitative difference. So the only reason we know that the visual area produces colors is because we can ask people. It's not like the lungs or the guts where you just have to understand the structure and you can predict everything it does. The only reason we know that the brain has anything to do with consciousness is by asking people. I think it's easy to miss how that makes the brain a very special organ. I also would say that, I mean, you may or may not be right about the dualist, but the panpsychist will say, I'm not a panpsychist, but the panpsychist will say, the visual areas have got, mini visual experiences built in or whatever. So they'll be able to predict that if you mess with that area, you'll mess with visual experience just as well as people who call that the visual cortex. I can't see any real difference there. So that's what I would say.
Well, in the case of the first one, like, don't computers also do that, where there's just a slightly different configuration of ones and zeros in the hard drive that produces completely different kinds of things, like tanks or clouds and mushrooms, like literally those exact things. So I don't see that as like too much of a miracle. That would seem to be just common computer science. And so saying that the brain could do the same thing, I don't see as any sufficiently different than to say a hard drive could do the same thing. So I don't know why we would call that a miracle any more than just common science. Whereas if we think that, I don't know what your position on is if hard drives are conscious. I would imagine no. And so the fact that hard drives can do the same thing with physical data to produce this diversity of different kinds of things that seem very different from one another, why think that since they're able to do the same thing but lack consciousness, why would we need the consciousness to explain the same data?
I mean, forget the analogy. You agree that like smells are very different from color experience, are very different from taste experience, right? They're like kind of incommensurably different things.
I don't think, I wouldn't say they're incommensurably different. I say they're different, but I wouldn't say they're incommensurably different.
But you can't taste a color. You can't see a taste. They don't exist in the same space, for want of a better term. They're just radically
That's
different.
the part I would disagree with, because I think that there are many kinds of like synesthesia where there are numbers have colors or whatever. And so I think that the fact that we don't taste a color is coincidental. And I think it is very possible to have a particular kind of neurology where you could literally taste colors. I wouldn't see that as a contradiction. It's not like a logical contradiction. So I wouldn't say they're incommensurable.
that with respect, I mean, synesthesia isn't a case where you taste colors. It's a case where I don't know, for example,
You see colors and numbers.
Colors and numbers is a case where one sense modality is provoked by stimulation of another. It's not a case where literally a taste figures in your visual experience. That's not what it happens. It's a cross modal effect, a cross sensory effect.
Right. So I was using that as an analogy because I think that there is a way to wire neurons in such a way that you can taste colors. We just don't know about it yet. So I don't think they're incommensurable. I wouldn't say that they're completely incommensurable. I think that, like how brains can be wired in such a way that numbers can have colors, you could wire it in such a way to blend taste and sound, or taste and touch, taste and smell, in such a way that there may be a way to literally taste colors. We just simply don't understand it yet. So I wouldn't say they're incommensurable.
I don't think that's a case of tasting colors. I think that's a case where stimulating your tongue produces color experience. Why isn't that the correct description? You're talking about cross-wiring neurons, presumably from my tongue to my visual cortex. That's not tasting colors. That's my tongue producing visual experience. I'm not saying that can't be done. I'm saying that amongst my color experience, a taste can't literally figure. In amongst the visual field, you don't find a taste. They're different kinds of thing. And so the point I'm making about the sensory areas is, though the machinery is relevantly similar, they produce radically different products. And we don't have the glimmer of a clue of how that's possible, just given the resources that physics and neuroscience tell us are in the brain. We don't have any clue about that at all. And that's what makes zombies conceivable, for example.
Right. So I'm not saying that we simply cross the neurons, and so that when you see something, it generates, in addition to that, a sensation of smell. I'm saying that there is probably a way where smell sensations can be seen visually. And I don't see that as a logical contradiction. I see that as more just like a limitation of our ability to model things in our minds, like a four-dimensional object. Like, we can't visually imagine a four-dimensional object. Can they exist? Perfectly fine. Four-dimensional objects make perfect sense mathematically. And so I think the same thing would be applied to like smells and tastes. I don't think that they're incommensurable logically. I think it's just because of how our brains work, that it seems like they're sufficiently different, when really it probably can be blended together, and it is possible to see smells in some way.
Well, you're making a speculation. If you're right, then I'm wrong. But you're just saying you think it's possible. You're admitting that they seem very different, and that's what I'm starting from. So we can say anything might be comprehensible, but if we don't work with what we find comprehensible right now, I'm not really sure what conclusions we can come to given the data we actually have.
Right. I was just objecting to the part where you said they were incommensurable. I would say there's no logical contradiction there. So I wouldn't say they're incommensurable, but I would agree they are different as far as we can tell.
I didn't say it was a logical contradiction. It's more of a point about how they seem, or it's more of a metaphysical point. I mean, when you lack one sense, you've got no way of getting into another one. Sorry, when you lack a sense, you've got no way of grasping it. I mean, it's like, the guy John Locke mentions, he says, I know what scarlet's like. It's like the sound of a trumpet. It's like, it's nothing like the sound of a trumpet. It's just something of a completely different order.
Because when I think of like neurological conditions where somebody loses one sense, to me, it's very much like phantom limb syndrome. So if they lose this sense, it gets replaced by a different sense, and they can indirectly get the same kind of observations as the brain just generates them randomly or something. And so people who are blind can technically see things if they get blind sight or something along those lines, where the brain is still processing them. And so I'd say that, even if I don't think there's a hard distinction between them, I think that if the brain processes things in the right way, you can probably get bleed over between those two.
Blind sight's actually interesting you mentioned that, because I tend to think that's quite a good case for thinking there might be unconscious color experience, because blind sight can distinguish between different kinds of color stimuli, and when we do that, that's because we see green or versus red or whatever it is. So that's a reason for thinking they've got unconscious color or unconscious color qualia, as I put it. But also, the thing you mentioned about brain plasticity is interesting. I mean, a different area of the brain can take over a function that you've lost from some other area. I mean, we've no idea how that's possible, and that seems to go to show that there's some basic, well, you might think that shows there's some fundamental ingredient there that enables different kinds of conscious experience or mental function, in which case that goes beyond anything we currently understand about neurons and their constituents.
Oh, sure. There's lots we don't understand about neurons. Definitely that one I agree with. But I'm still like, to me, it seems like panpsychism, where there's consciousness is fundamental, or pantheism or idealism. It seems like saying there's a soul out there, kind of in a way, that there's this new ontology of stuff that is fundamental, and that seems like a stretch. It seems like you're adding more entities than are required to explain the data. And why would that be preferred to, say, some, like, just granting everything's material, because that's what we see, most things are material as far as we can tell, without this consciousness property, and it's just emergent. That seems to fit the data, as far as I can tell, much better.
What do you mean by emergent? Just out of interest, because you've said that a few times now.
As in, I mean, I'm happy with weak emergence or strong emergence, where it's like literally some new property pops out of nothingness. That would be fine too. But I think either one of those would be more plausible than to say that there is consciousness is in everything in some respect, or the quality properties are in everything in some respect. That'd be like the soul analogy, where there's just soul is everywhere, and that seems like a much stronger argument, or much stronger claim, than to say that there's some emergence of some kind that we just don't understand yet. Because I think emergence of, like, wetness, for example, there is no property of wetness or water in hydrogen or oxygen, but when you combine hydrogen and oxygen, you get water and wetness quite easily. And so I think this consciousness could be the same kind of a thing, where it is properties of physical systems and neurons could combine in such a way to produce consciousness, like wetness or water. Whether it's strong or weakly emergent, that doesn't make much difference to me. I think strong emergence is obviously be a stronger claim and be less plausible, but either of those would still seem simpler than that it's some fundamental essence of some kind.
But I mean, strong emergence is the idea that there is literally no explanation. There just isn't one. It's not that we don't know it now. There's not one there to be had. There's no reason why a particular property pops out of, whatever basis it is. There's no logic to it, whatever. It's kind of a miracle. So I would have thought that is, I'm surprised that you say that's more plausible than the idea that there's some kind of extra property to matter that might help us to, in the future, explain why putting matter together gives us consciousness. I'm surprised that you think. I'd like to know why you think. I mean, you're supposed to be asking a question, but why do you think that the idea that there's, it's literally a miracle that, say, water is wet, or I mean, that's an example we can explain it, but strong emergence would be literally a miracle. So I'm struck by your thinking that that's more plausible than a view like panpsychism, or my view. I don't think consciousness is everywhere, but we can come to that later. Yeah, I'm just struck by you saying that.
Well, I don't consider it as much of a miracle. I consider it more like something like magic, where it follows some kind of organized system of laws. So say there's some kind of law in the universe that if you combined a rock and a potato, a tesseract pops out or something. Now, it obviously makes no sense. There's no, like, logical necessity that this happens. But if there's some law in the universe that necessitates when you throw a rock and a potato together, poof, there's a tesseract, I would call that strong emergence. And not that there's no reason for it, because there's this law there that causes this to happen. But the reason it's strong emergence is because there's nothing within the properties of a rock or a potato that lead to tesseract. There just happens to be this random law that causes that to happen for no reason whatsoever.
So kind of magic. You called it magic a minute ago.
Sure. But there is a reason. There is a law there that makes it happen. It's just there's no internal components of the rock or potato that lead to this anyway.
But a dualist can say there are psychophysical laws as well, and they will look pretty magical as well. So you've got magic on your side, magic on their side, magic all around. Doesn't seem too much to choose from the different kinds of. It's just a question of what kind of magic do you prefer. It's not anymore a question about what science can show. It's not anymore a question about naturalism. It's a question about which sort of magic do we find most pleasing. So it sounds like you're perhaps closer to my crazy side than you made out at first, or more simple.
Well, that was just an objection to strong emergence in general. Like I wouldn't say it's for no reason. That was the only objection there. It's not something for no reason, and one possible reason would be like a universal law that causes it to be the case. Another possible reason could be that there's some interaction between the particles that generates this thing. So it wouldn't have to be some kind of universal law in that case. So either way, strong emergence could be a local phenomenon related to some properties that cause this new property to emerge without this universal force thingy. And that would be far simpler than to say consciousness is some essence in the universe of everything. And I think saying that it's some emergent property, I think it's weakly emergent. I don't think it's strongly emergent. That either way, it's still going to be better than to say consciousness is fundamental in everything. I don't see why that would be the case. It'd be kind of like the argument that in order to see galaxies, I need to look through a telescope. Therefore, telescopes are intrinsic in galaxies. They're made of telescopes. That doesn't make sense to me. Like I don't see why. Like the fact that we see this doesn't mean why would we infer that it's in all things and not just a local phenomenon.
But I mean, unless you want to abandon strong emergentism, I think it would be kind of make your argument stronger if you did. But if you don't, if you want to leave that in as a possibility, the idea would be that, say, mind is created by either a universal law relating, certain organizations of matter to consciousness, or, like you say, by some kind of local, more random interaction between brains and consciousness. So on strong emergentism, consciousness which is a non-physical property, has got to be created by the brain. So that's a less elegant hypothesis than dualism. Dualism says the mind's already there. They're just related by some law. Your law's got to create non-physical consciousness, and the dualist doesn't have to create that. It already exists.
Wait, why is that simpler?
Sorry?
Why is that simpler? So like if I said there's two fundamental essences that permeate everywhere in the universe, whereas saying there's one fundamental essence and it creates a tiny little bit of a second essence, why would that be less simple than saying, or why would that be more complicated than saying there's two fundamental essences that are everywhere?
It's got more explaining to do. It's got to explain how the thing gets created, as well as the covariations. All the dualist law has got to do is explain that is not even explain in your sense just means link by a law, is link them the covariations between the two. So I think your theory's got more to do in that sense, but at least it doesn't seem any more elegant than dualism. So it's kind of seems at best on a par. So again, you seem to be letting in, the choice seems to be between different varieties of magic. And once we get into that field, you've got panpsychism has got going for it the thing you just claimed as a virtue, namely one kind of thing, conscious stuff all the way down, all the way. As I say, I'm not a panpsychist, but if you think that's a virtue, then you should be a panpsychist kind of emergentist, weak emergentist, and not that seems like a better view than the strong emergentism you're talking about, because the mentality's in the ingredients already. It doesn't have to strongly emerge.
Well, for consciousness, I get to think that consciousness is fundamental is to think like telescopes are fundamental. The fact that we need telescopes to see other universes doesn't mean that telescopes are intrinsic in everything. It's just a epistemic meaning. So I don't think there's any reason to think consciousness is fundamental any more than to think telescopes are fundamental. And that's why I reject all versions of mind first philosophies. But I did want to ask like a more general question, like if there's 10 different fundamental essences that you think are in the universe, why would that be simpler than to think there's one fundamental essence that then creates another one? Because I'm not following the fact that simply the fact that you say it's first makes it simpler.
I'm just saying your theory's got more to do. It's got to explain not just the covariation between the mind and matter. It's got to explain how matter creates the mind. Whereas
why? That's the part I'm not following. Because like if I say that they're fundamental essences in the universe, I've still not explained that. I've just kind of asserted that they exist fundamentally. And why would that not require an explanation, but in the context of just saying, well, matter just does it, I don't know how it does it, be any less of an assertion in this case? So simply saying that it's fundamental to the universe as an assertion versus it's emergent as an assertion doesn't seem any different epistemically, or why one would be less simple in that context.
Well, let's say they're equally simple. Like, I'm happy with that. The point is just that, dualism doesn't look so bad compared to strong emergentism, which is a view that you think is okay. As to the point about not liking mind first views. I mean, I'm not fond of this argument, but I hear it from friends of mine who are panpsychists a lot. Like Galen Strawson, quite a well-known panpsychist, will say stuff like, consciousness is all we know. We never get to get outside of our consciousness. The idea that there's anything else is a kind of extra posit. So he thinks it's matter that's got to earn its keep, matter conceived as a mind consciousness independent posit, and not consciousness, which he'll say is a thing we know intimately and all the time, that we're, alert. And there's something to that argument. It's just not obvious that I'm struck by why people have more confidence in what they call matter than they do in consciousness. After all, when physicists tell us about the properties of matter, it's because they measure them, but the way they know about their measurements is by being conscious of them. So the thing that's the common denominator in all of science is consciousness.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I agree that the common denominator in cosmology is telescopes. Like obviously we couldn't see anything about the cosmic microwave background without telescopes. Couldn't you make exactly the same argument though and say, well, really what's fundamental isn't the cosmic microwave background radiation, it's the telescope, because you need the telescope to see the cosmic microwave background radiation.
I'm not quite seeing the analogy, but I mean, I take it a telescope is nothing without the observer. A telescope itself doesn't give us astronomy. What gives us astronomy is a Galileo or someone looking down the telescope, and the reason why they can do astronomy is because they're conscious. So again, you get that consciousness is the common denominator, even if, I mean, I don't suppose that we will only be able to measure the microwave background using a telescope, or rather what people call a telescope now has been expanded to include things that can detect microwave background. I mean, it used to be that telescope meant something detecting, something through which light waves passed exclusively. But yeah, I'm not quite seeing the telescope analogy, but that might just be me.
So I think like the structure of the argument is that the only thing we know is consciousness. So we use consciousness as our epistemic means to learn about other things potentially. And so consciousness is the thing that we should assume is the first property that exists of some kind. And epistemically, I would agree. Like epistemic solipsism, first thing we have is consciousness, fully agree. But then to say that the other things we're seeing are a product of consciousness, they're made of consciousness or something, to me would be the same thing as saying, because I need a telescope to see the CMB, it's a product of the telescope. Like maybe it's just like a splotch on the end or something that's not there. It's just a product of the telescope. And so I think that even though I agree from a starting point, we do have to use conscience as a starting point. That doesn't mean it's the most fundamental. And once we gain some kind of another additional methodology to verify things like novel testable predictions, then we have good reason to try to justify belief in external things are in fact external and not just a product of our conscious minds. And so to say that because we use consciousness to verify other things, that they must therefore be made of consciousness, would seem analogous to say that because we use telescopes to see the CMB, it's a product of the telescope.
Right. I don't think, I mean, I see there's an argument about like a kind of epistemic argument like the one you're mounting, but the one I was referring to mainly was when people say, I don't want to spend a lot more time defending panpsychists because I'm not one, but just, I can see why they say the thing I know for sure is my consciousness. That's the medium through which I access telescopes and results of scientific measuring instruments. If there's one thing I can, as it were, posit for sure, it's consciousness. Anything outside of that is something of a leap because I don't have direct access to it. What I have direct access to is consciousness. So if you're going to ask, if you think there's one stuff that the universe is made of, or one nature, it's a natural starting point to think that might be consciousness. And if you think that, again, this is me being devil's advocate a bit because I'm speaking on their behalf, then you don't get a mind-body problem. You get that big consciousnesses are made out of small consciousnesses. I mean, there are other problems, but you don't get that problem. Whereas if you posit matter that's not conscious and not minded, you immediately generate this problem of where you get the mind from. So I can see that the way they get to panpsychism.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I would agree as a starting point, but I think that because we have science, and I think science does justify all the material stuff, and we can infer from like evolution things that seems to be brains seem to be a product of evolution. We can then, after we've garnered this new methodology to justify stuff exists called science, and then it shows all this stuff exists, and we can map on the path of the universe or the history or whatever, and we can say, oh look, their brains came out like here. Then it's reasonable to infer that it's a product of physical stuff. So I agree that you do have to have some additional thing to justify matter, because we don't start with matter, we start with minds. But I think we have that with novel testable predictions.
Sorry, tell me how we get. Sorry, I didn't mean. Am I interrupting?
No, go ahead.
Tell me how we get anything from science that predicts that there's non-sentient, non-conscious matter anywhere. What is the result from science that gives any reason to believe that?
Yeah, so we start with the conscious experience, I think, therefore I am, and then we have different kinds of experiences. Like I imagine a unicorn, I don't see a unicorn, so there's different classes, the imaginary and the experiential. And we need some kind of a method to differentiate which kinds of things are imaginary and experiential, and the method we come up with is novel predictions. If it can accurately predict the future, that's a good reason to believe that the thing is there, one of the experiential things, not one of the imaginary things. And of those classes of hypotheses that can accurately predict the future, there is one that there is actually stuff there, and it's not conscious, it's just like a rock or whatever. And that can predict things like when we break the rock open, it's not going to scream or whatever. I don't know. And so the fact that we have this method that seems to be able to justify classes of things that exist in the experiential kind. And of those hypotheses, some of them include there are non-conscious mattery blob things, or that consciousness results from brains, as far as we can tell. Using an inductive argument, all the things that we can verify are conscious seem to have brains. We can infer that one of the hypotheses is that consciousness is an emergent property of brains, and that seems to explain the data fairly well.
What we know is that all the things that can talk have got brains. We don't know that all the things that are conscious have got brains. We're pretty sure that things that have got consciousness like us have got brains, but there's nothing that tells us that a rock isn't conscious. It might seem like unnecessary to say that it is, but there's no positive evidence that it's not. I mean, you say that rocks can't scream, but a lot of things that are conscious can't scream. People with locked-in syndrome, for example. So not being able to scream isn't much of a test. So but again, I'm like defending a cause I don't really believe in. But I think the panpsychists will say there's just no reason to. There's just no datum on. There's no data. There's no theory for on the basis of which you've got a good reason for withholding experience from things. By which they mean consciousness.
Right. So I would say that the ability to use the physicalist hypothesis to make successful predictions, and the fact that they have got them correct prior to knowing them, is a reason to believe that that hypothesis is correct, even though it isn't like falsify idealism or panpsychism. The fact that it has been able to be used to make successful predictions, and probably I think more than any other hypothesis has done so, is the reason to believe it's true.
But the panpsychists I know and my own theory kind of, they sneak into physics, right? They say there are extra properties to particles or whatever it might be that are relevant to generating minds. So whatever predictions physics can make, or physicalism as you call it, they can also make, because they help themselves to the same mathematical apparatus. They just say there are extra properties there. So there's one extra thing they can predict that the physicalist theory can't. They can predict that when you put something together in the right way, you'll get a mind out of it. So there is an extra prediction they can make that the physicalist theory can't make. And they can make just as good predictions as the physicalist framework can make. So it would seem they've got the advantage.
Well, I mean, I think physicalists do make that prediction that if consciousness is a result of physical stuff, it would necessarily entail that combinations of physical stuff would prove conscious. So I think that would be a prediction made by physicalists. But I think the important thing here is the making the prediction first. So if I can make a prediction first, like say, there's going to be a transitional fossil between lizards and fish found in this stratum of the thing called Tiktaalik. The fact that somebody believes in God can say, well, I could explain that. God did evolution, whatever. This hypothesis would not be evidence of God. It would be evidence of whatever hypothesis they were using to make the prediction and got it right in the first place. So if they were naturalists and said, I believe this because of evolution, because of naturalism, that is evidence of evolution. The fact that I could say God just snapped his fingers and put a fossil there and actually created the world 6,000 years ago, the fact that they can make it fit that hypothesis doesn't mean it's evidence of that hypothesis. It would only be evidence if they took that hypothesis, God created the world 6,000 years ago, and he created a fake fossil of a transitional form between fish and lizards and put it here. Then it would be evidence of the 6,000-year hypothesis, because they were able to predict the information before we knew it. But the only ones who were able to do that was the evolution guys. And so the fact that the alternative hypothesis can make it fit the data doesn't make it evidence of their hypothesis, where it is evidence of the one who actually predicted it and got it right first, which seems to be the physicalist camp.
You know, lots of neuroscientists are dualists.
Yes, I'm familiar. I've talked to many of them.
And the reason they're dualists is because when you investigate the neural structure, you're just struck by the fact that it doesn't get anywhere near explaining why there's consciousness. It's not the case that we could predict from brains that they produce consciousness. It's not like looking at the structure of a lung and being able to just to grasp that it exchanges gases and it gets oxygen into the bloodstream. That just is breathing. It's not like looking at the liver and seeing that it helps to clean the blood. The only reason we know that the brain produces consciousness is because people say so. So it's just not the case that we can predict in the way that you're claiming. That you started off by saying if the mind follows from physical stuff, but that's the very assumption. That's an assumption. That's the thing I'm asking you to give some evidence for. It can't be given as an assumption, and it's just striking that we can't predict how conscious experience is going to vary when we tamper with the brain. We can't do it at all.
What would falsify your hypothesis?
My own.
Yes, you're not the panpsychist alternative, yours specifically.
That's a good question. You're going to accuse me of non-scientific theory in a moment. I can see.
Unfalsifiability. Yeah.
Well, if someone comes out tomorrow and says, "Look, I've got a very good physicalist explanation of qualia," or "Here's a good reason to think that qualia are just illusions," and then I would, I would accept that, and I would say, okay, there's no need for my theory. My theory is, I mean, I'm not saying I believe. I don't think we should hold theories 100%. I think like when we hold theories, we should hold them like on tiptoes. So you should always be ready to move. You should have like 1 foot in one and 1 foot on the other. You should always be ready to be shown to be wrong. I mean, I'm not sure that there's empirical evidence that could disprove my theory, but there's certainly what you might call philosophical evidence that could disprove it, or arguments that could disprove it, or show that there's a better or more elegant hypothesis. And so I'm open to it being disproven in those ways. I guess I'm not claiming it's a scientific hypothesis; it's a metaphysical hypothesis. So if you say it's not a scientific theory, I'm not sure that's going to upset me too much. I think often in science, certainly in philosophy, it's more of a question of which theory best fits all the things we believe and know, which theory is consistent with the data but has the virtues of elegance, parsimony, capturing all the things we want to capture. And I tend to think my theory does that better than some other ones. I mean, the main objection I've got to panpsychists is they can't make sense of there being unconscious bits of the mind, and that's the thing I think is that they miss, and I take very seriously the unconscious bits of the mind.
Yeah, I think I would disagree. I think that simplicity, while it's nice, it isn't probably the most important thing. So if we had the most complicated theory in the world, say that there's an all-powerful, all-knowing being who sends a cosmic zombie Jew to sacrifice himself and we eat of his skin and just whatever. If that hypothesis accurately predicted more things about the universe and got it right, no matter if it's the most complicated, ridiculous hypothesis ever, be like, yep, that's the right one. I don't care if there's a simpler hypothesis. This one did it first. So like if the Bible said like the universe is 14.8 billion years old or 13.8 billion years old, DNA is a double helix, and it said all of this in a book that was written 10,000 years ago, I'd be like, I believe it. I don't care how ridiculously stupid, simple it is.
I mean, I totally agree with you, but this just goes back to my point that our understanding of the brain can't predict that it's conscious. I mean, the Greeks thought the mind was situated in the heart. We think it's the brain because we mess with the brain and people say stuff. Descartes looked at the brain quite extensively, and it made him into a dualist. I'm always struck by how many neuroscientists are dualists, and the reason is we can't predict very much from the structure of the brain about consciousness.
Would there be like what would it take if we saw a robot? Could you ask it questions, and what questions would have to answer, like a Turing test, for you to be convinced that it was conscious?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess I don't think that having a mental life requires consciousness. So it wouldn't make, if it could answer a bunch of questions, it wouldn't make me very confident that it was conscious. I'm not really sure what would make me confident it was conscious, but if it could, so what was the guy at testing that chatbot recently who thought that it was sentient? Was that a Google chatbot or something?
Yeah, the Google one.
Yeah. What was it called? I forget the name of it. Do you know? Probably.
Don't remember.
But anyway, like I mean, I read his description of his interactions with it, and I thought, oh God, maybe it is sentient. It seems to me that if I interacted with something and it really passed the Turing test, like over time, I wouldn't really have a choice about thinking it had a mental life. It's not like I could reason myself out of that. It's just how I would start to treat it, I think. Consciousness.
My
Sorry,
objection here is that because mental states don't require consciousness, doesn't your model have the same problem of how does consciousness arise from mental states that the materialist would have of how does consciousness arise from material? And if that is the case, would you ever be able to say that that computer is more than just mental states that are not conscious?
Yeah, it's a good thing, good point, and it's the objection that I face most often. You know, people say, okay, you've got the redness and the taste and the qualities in there, but how do we actually get any experience of them or awareness of them? And yeah, it's definitely a problem. I mean, it has an advantage over, I think, over regular physicalist theories because it's got some of the ingredients of consciousness. I mean, I think there's like if you think about Mary in the black and white room, she knows all the physical science of vision. She knows it, albeit in black and white, and she's never seen red herself. And Frank Jackson thinks that when she comes to see red, she learns this new thing, what red is like. She learns what red is like. She doesn't learn what consciousness is like because she's already conscious. She's just a normal human being. So what she learns about a particular quality, redness, that's the thing she can't understand from the science textbooks she's got. So I tend to think the problem of quality, so to speak, is more serious than the problem of consciousness. I'm not sure. I mean, I have a theory of consciousness as in awareness, but again, I'm not like 100% committed to it. It's a kind of a version of a higher order thought theory. I don't know if you're familiar with those. I mean, I can explain it if you like, but yeah, I accept that's a challenge. And people will react to that by going panpsychist, but I guess I agree with you that panpsychism is like a leap too far. I think we need like we need a rich enough picture of what's in matter to give us mindedness. Physicalism gives you a bit too little because it can't explain how we get qualitative mental states. Panpsychism maybe gives us too much because it puts little people, atoms into little people or particles into little people, which is a little bit crazy for me. So I kind of think something up the middle is the right sort of territory. Stick qualities into matter, but not consciousness itself. Something in that ballpark strikes me as the best solution, some kind of middle ground view. But yeah, I accept it's a challenge how to explain consciousness itself. Yeah,
Gotcha.
I don't have the answer right now.
I was thinking, like, what would it take for a materialist explanation of how consciousness arises? Like, what would that mean? Because the first thing I would think of is, say, maybe some interaction of matter can generate a consciousness field of some kind. So it doesn't start there. There's not an initial consciousness everywhere, but matter can produce a consciousness field in some way. Why would that? And then the neurons can then interact with that field to produce redness and flavor and taste and touch and whatever. Why would that be not preferable to it's fundamentally everywhere?
How do you get colors out of things that lack qualities altogether? I mean, if I tell you that I'm gonna produce the Mona Lisa just using a pencil and paper, you'll say it can't be done. You can't get color out of black and white pencil marks. And I have that kind of conceptual obstacle to understanding how the austerely conceived physical world can produce a conscious field, as you put it. I'm actually reading a PhD thesis right now who says that he thinks consciousness is like an extra field, and that it's interaction with the physical world that somehow links the two up. And that sounds kind of cool. I'm not sure I wholly understand it, but the idea of it being intelligibly, as in not strongly emerging, intelligibly generated from such austere ingredients just sounds incredible to me.
Well, that's the part I'm really curious about, because saying that it's unintelligible for this field to come about by matter, why is that any less confusing or surprising than to say the field just exists fundamentally in reality? To say that reality just has this field wouldn't seem to be any less, or shouldn't seem any less weird or confusing than to say that it comes about by matter. Why is it that saying that it comes about by matter is less attractive for some reason?
You might be right, but after all, I don't say that the qualities are an extra field or anything like that. I say that they're the intrinsic or categorical or the heart of matter, the bit that, you know, people, this goes back to Russell, but Bertrand Russell thought that physics gives us a kind of skeletal description of the universe. It tells us a lot about what an electron does, let's say, but it doesn't tell us what an electron really is. So it's a bit like if all I know about you is that you do a podcast and you go running every day and you eat this, that, and the other. I know a lot about your activities, but I don't know who you are, your character, so to speak. So Russell thought there's something missing from the physics description of the universe, which is the character of these particles, what they're really like inside. And so there's this kind of gap in them, and you might put something in there that's relevant to mentality, and then help us to explain how we get minds. That's the rationale behind it. It's not that there's an independent field. Also, I think my view is supported in a way by common sense. I mean, and Berkeley said this about his idealism. If you read the 3 dialogues between Hylas and Philinus, which is like one of my favorite philosophical texts, just so nicely written, you know, he says this crazy stuff, the whole world is made of mentality, but at the end he says he's just defending common sense, because when you open your eyes, you see colored objects. That's what your senses tell you. It doesn't tell you that there's a world of intrinsically colorless, tasteless, touchless matter out there, insensate stuff. It tells you that, you know, the chair, the cup is blue, and his view vindicates that. Well, my view is also vindicates that, because it says the world is suffused with qualities, which is the way it presents itself to us. So I think it's not so crazy. It's not like you said, like putting the soul everywhere.
So how is that different from saying there's a field everywhere? So to say that like matter has this property of qualities, how is that different than to say there is a field of qualities? I don't.
Well, they're different. They're different theories. You mean how is it better, or?
Yeah, like how the ontological commitment of saying that there's this extra kind of properties that exist in matter seems equivalent to say there is this extra kind of field that has the same properties.
Right. I suppose, I mean, if you buy the Russell line, there's a kind of a need for an extra set of properties. If you think that there's more to an electron than what it does, or there's something that grounds or explains the dispositions it has, it's not just a brute fact that it's got unit 1 negative charge and it repels other electrons and attracts protons. There's like some ground in its nature, in its being, in its character for that. Just in the way that there's a ground in your nature and your character for why you have this cool show and why you, I don't know, go running or eat what you do. There's like explanations for that are rooted in your character. If you have a similar intuition about the explanation of the behaviors of basic particles, you'll think there's a need for something else. And then the question is, what is that something else? The positing of a whole other field that's completely separate is less well motivated, I would say. I mean, Russell thinks there's a gap in physics already. There's something else that needs putting in there already, because it only gives us this behaviorist. It's like, you know how people say behaviorism didn't really explain mentality, because behaviorists would say, what is it to think that it's raining outside? It's just to pick up an umbrella and take it with you. What is it to be in pain? It's just to scream and say ouch. There's no like inner mental state. There's just your behavior. They did that because it would make mentality easily measurable. But, you know, people would object, well, that doesn't get to the painfulness of pain. It doesn't get to what it's like to think that it's raining outside, the character of those states. And Russell's thought about physics is the same. It only gives us a behavior. It only tells us about the behavior of matter. It doesn't tell us about what it really is. So I think that would be the difference between those two theories. The physics description already has a kind of gap in it. It's like got this yawning hole waiting to be filled.
Well, whenever I hear the word gap, I think God of the gaps argument. That's the first thing that comes to mind. Why would this? Because when you say that there's this gap, saying that the gap is filled by a quality of particles versus saying the gap is filled by a field, what's the difference there?
Oh, that's fine. If that works, I don't know enough to know how that would work, but I don't think that would be far enough off my view for me to object to that. I think that sounds pretty cool to me.
And if there's no difference between the field and the particles versus strong emergence, would you say that any of those has an advantage over the others?
Well, I mean, some things are basic, right? Why is there mass? There may or may not be an explanation. Why is the speed of light exactly as it is and not different? There may or may not be an explanation, but there's going to be some basic facts, right? If there's a lowest level of particles, that's going to be a fundamental truth. There are going to be X number of basic particles. Why? There may not be a further reason. So if there's a qualitative field and it already exists, that can be a basic fact. The thing about strong emergentism is things popping out of nowhere by magic. It could have been any which way. Once it exists, there's no reason why it couldn't have been otherwise. And I find that less preferable to a universe which is intelligible. But I suppose you're saying, well, when it comes to the things we find that just happen to be the basics, as opposed to things that pop into existence. Oh, yeah, maybe there's something to that. I don't know. I'd have to think about that a bit more. But I see
Yeah,
what you're
I think
saying.
that is the core of my disagreement, where I think people have an intrinsic bias to think that saying something is fundamental is intuitively more attractive than saying it popped out of existence like 5 seconds ago or something. And I don't understand why. And I think that's a really interesting part of the debate, that the same reason people think there's a God, because it must be fundamental and created the universe, as opposed to being emergent makes it better in some way. Like the ontological argument you mentioned, that there's this betterness, that if it's originated, that makes it better than if it just popped out of nothing. And I think that's a really interesting question that is relevant to these debates that isn't explored very much.
Well, I mean, you're right, but I mean, if things popped out, I mean, emergent means like it's a higher level property or thing in the sense of not being to do with the microparticles, the smallest stuff. But if there are strongly emergent things like the mind or is strongly emergent, that is in a sense, the mind is in a sense fundamental. It's just not fundamental in the sense of being the smallest. It's fundamental in the sense of being, you know, metaphysically irreducible or not further explainable. It would be a high level fundamental. So there are views like that. But I guess if you're saying, you know, strong emergentism and your kind of view are on a par, well, yes, except bracket this point that there's something missing from physics, and then that requires plugging. And if we do plug it in the right way, we might get an intelligible explanation of consciousness. Whereas on a strong emergentist view, that's precisely what we don't get.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
We have a question from the audience, from Efont. What are your thoughts on the holographic universe?
Not a lot.
Gotcha.
What do you think about it?
The holographic universe principle, that everything is just fundamentally information, kind of like just taking I forget what it's called, the holographic principle, where all information can be represented on a 2D sphere, or on a 2D surface of a sphere, for all of the 3D things that can be represented on the inside. I think that makes perfect sense as a way to explain the information paradox of a black hole. I don't think we're actually in a universe that does that, and we're just all like some kind of weird holographic projection. That seems too weird for me, but I think it's a funny hypothesis to talk about.
I quite like it. I mean, the thesis I'm reading at the moment is suggesting that space-time as we perceive it is a kind of protrusion of a far more high dimensional space. But the guy thinks that one of those dimensions is consciousness, and that's how we get conscious experience. That's pretty cool. I don't have anything particularly to say for or against it. Right? It's a pretty cool idea.
Awesome. All right. I think that was it for the super chats. We have been going for about an hour and a half. It was a great conversation. Really appreciate you coming on. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find out more about your work?
You could look at my homepage, which is www. I'll just pull it up. Academia.edu. Well, shall I just put the link? Can I put the link in the chat?
Sure. I can transfer it over to the YouTube chat. And while you are doing that, Winston's mom asked, what is one book he would want us all to read?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, there's a really good book by a guy called Michael Lockwood called Mind, Brain, and the Quantum. So he defended a view quite like mine. He thought that qualities were in matter, but consciousness was not. And he also tried to integrate that with to explain certain results in physics. So it's pretty cool. And a lot of the time when I'm doing philosophical work, I find myself, you know, coming up with ideas or results and then finding that Lockwood got there already. So I would recommend reading that. So it's Michael Lockwood, Mind, Brain, and the Quantum. It's a really cool book.
Will you put the link in the chat?
How do I do it?
There's a private chat in the bottom of the screen, and if you post
Yep.
it in there, I can copy it and send it to all the different places that it's streaming, because I have a There's a chat on the side.
Done.
Cool. Winston's mom just posted it too. hertz.academy.edu/Sam Coleman. Yep. So
Thanks.
Winston's mom just posted it for us. That's awesome.
Yeah, and maybe I'll post the name of the book as well, shall I? Just
sure.
Make it. And you could also read like Russell. Russell's really good. Russell's got a book called Analysis of Matter, where he also defends a view like this. I'll put that in as well. Be interested in those, and drop me an email as well if you like. Should I put my email in, or
sure.
if anyone wants to discuss this stuff further? Okay.
Awesome. Thanks again. Really appreciate it, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Cheers, and you take care.